Just as a quick introduction, my name is Jason. I was the president of the Undergraduate Science Journal last semester, and I'm so proud of what ARIA has achieved along with the current executive board. Now more than ever, there is an important need to maintain a scientific community, and I believe that NUCSJ brings our journals closer together. I look forward to more collaborations with other journals participating today as we work to bring our community closer together. So now let's get on with the first panel. So we will be discussing how is scientific literature absorbed and disseminated. The panel will try to evaluate the use of scientific literature in scientific practice and journalism. And in addition, we will discuss how undergraduates can try to make informed conclusions about scientific literature in both their own research and publication processes they might have at their own undergraduate journals. So I'll start with a some quick bios of our panelists so you can get a sense of their experiences. So starting with Christina Monin. So Christina is an associate researcher for NOVA on PBS. An experienced fact checker, she has contributed to dozens of science documentaries, including the 2 Emmy-nominated films and a DuPont Columbia finalist for Decoding COVID-19. As a 2018 Cell Press intern, Monin previewed research for international outlets like the New York Times, National Geographic, and Science Friday. She graduated Columbia University with an environmental biology thesis on cross-species birdsongs. During the quarantine, she has enjoyed tackling jigsaw puzzles and exploring parks in Greater Boston. So moving on to our next panelist, John Walensky. So John is a Khosla Family Professor of Education and Associate Dean of Student Affairs at Stanford University. He directs the Public Knowledge Project, which conducts research and develops open source scholarly publishing software in support of the greater access to knowledge. He's working on the book, Fixing Copyright Constitutional Violation, a proposal to restore the law's ability to promote the progress of science. And last but not least, we have Deborah Blum. Deborah Blum is a Pulitzer-prize winning science writer who is the director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT and the publisher of the Undark magazine. She's the author of 6 books, 2 of them which have been made into documentary films and have been written for and has written for publications ranging from the New York Times to Wired. She also sits on boards of the Council for the Advancement of Scientific Writing, the Scientist, the Chemical Engineer Muse, and the MIT Museum. So as you can see, we have a very varied panel with many experiences. So I think that we'll just dive right into the first couple of questions. So I'm going to split up the questions between questions directed about approaching a paper and then questions directed about how we can improve our submissions as journals. So starting with our approach to papers, what do you guys believe is the first thing we should do when we start reading a research paper?
Are you doing this in any particular order, Jason?
We can have an order. Does anyone want to go first, and then we can just rotate from there?
Well, since I jumped in, why don't I start from the
Go for it. Yeah.
point of view? Yeah. So in science journalism, we tend to follow a kind of very basic routine in reading a scientific paper. You read the abstract, and then you jump to the bottom and you look at the conclusions and the discussion, and you use both of those things to try to make a decision on whether this is a research paper that's worth media attention. If you go through the discussion and the conclusions and you decide that it is, then usually you'll go back up to the methods section to further try to validate the paper itself. At least I do this, and I look for a couple of things. I won't list everything I look for, but in the methods section, I'll look for a number of test subjects, how the controls were applied. And because I have for the last 10 years written about toxicology, if it's a tox paper, then I'll look for anything that suggests that a mechanism for a particular toxic agent was actually elucidated. And then the last thing I'll do, if I go through all of those steps and I decide that it's a paper worth pursuing, is I'll look at the citations to see who's being referenced and who the other experts are in the field. That allows me, because no good journalist ever just quotes the PI on the wonders of his or her own paper, but tries to get context and perspective on the work. That allows me to see who else is there, who has been done site-worthy research in the same subject. And the last thing I'll do before I actually start interviewing is I'll run both the PI or, if there's several main authors, all of them, and anyone else I'm going to interview through Google Scholar, so that I can look at, where they are in the field and what they've published, and try for myself to vet their expertise. So that's a sort of nerdy process. The last thing I'll tell you really quickly is that at the National Association of Science Journalists, which is the largest association of science writers in the country, and I was president of that many years ago. But we have an ongoing discussion about the not doing single study reporting, right? That a single study is often just a data point, that if you call too much attention to a single study, you sometimes can overstate what it really means. So that's something that is an ongoing discussion in the community of science journalism. Anyway, that's sort of everything that I would add to this part of the conversation at this point, but I'm happy to answer other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Blum. Really appreciate that insight. Particularly, I was struck by, the acknowledgement that when you're reading scientific papers, there's usually a non-sequential process, especially when you're trying to read for a purpose. You're going to go maybe from the abstract to jump around to the conclusion, similar to what you just described. And then I think another point that's important is this idea that we shouldn't rely just upon a single study, that it should be sort of a consensus of reports that are provided by the scientific community. And then once we have that consensus, that information can be disseminated to the broader community. I think that those are all both really important points, especially for people that are getting into scientific journalism. So with that, I'm wondering, Mr. Walensky or Christina, do you guys have any questions? Or sorry, do you guys have any other responses?
Sure.
I do, but Christina, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'd say that my process is very similar to Deborah's, but another section that I really pay attention to is the funders. Often toward the acknowledgements, they'll list various grants or other labs that have contributed financially to their work. And I find that could be really an important section, particularly if there's corporate funding or funding from industry that might not necessarily bias the results, but bias perhaps their interpretation.
And, I'll pick up as well. This is going to be quite a load on everybody. So everything Deborah said and everything Christina said. And on top of that, as if you didn't need, if you needed more advice on this. One thing is how you find the papers. There are papers you're assigned in class, no question. You read them, I think, as Deborah said, and you think certainly about the funding. There's a lot of controversy around the funding, particularly in the biomedical field, that you should be sensitive to. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but let me go back to when you have a choice, when you're doing a research paper, when you're working on a research project. I'm a big fan of Google Scholar. And in particular around the idea of the citations. You can learn a lot about a paper's position in the world, or in the field at least, if not the world, by the number of citations, which Google Scholar includes, cited by, just on the bottom left-hand side. And you want to be sure that you've got a paper that has some prominence in the field, or you want to at least know that. It could be brand new with no citations, but then maybe you want to see what are the major papers in the field. So Deborah mentioned context, and I think that's a really crucial aspect in terms of the only way to make sense of things is to put it into context. There's no way an isolated piece or a single paper, as Deborah said, can really add to your understanding in a way that the larger context can't in fact increase and build a stronger understanding of. So when you find, when you're doing a search, paying attention to, and again, it depends on the age of the paper, the number of citations. It sometimes tells you how clearly you have a field pinned down. If you have a large number of citations in the first paper that's listed in a search that you do, it means that you've got a pretty prominent field. And if the the paper that comes up first is almost no citations, then your search may be too narrow, and you're not gaining a broader perspective of the area. So thinking about where your paper fits in a field is a really important aspect. And the idea of working within a field will add to your vocabulary within that field and the concepts you're working. So you're really building a contextual framework for a field or an area or a topic, or even a single issue. And that to me is a crucial part of coming. I'm getting nods, that's really good, thank you. Getting reinforcement here. So I'd like to kind of segue into this context thing a little more, if I could, Jason. And
of course, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's a very important aspect, and I just want to build on that. So we've talked about the context outside the paper. That is where it fits within the field and the area. Once you're inside the paper, and again, let me say that Deborah's technique of abstract to conclusions, checking the references, not like me, because I check for my name first, of course, in the references. And if it's not there, I move on. But that pure vanity. More importantly is this idea of how do I make sense of difficult aspects of the paper? How do I support my understanding of the paper? Because you're always going to be a bit of a novice, even, and let me give you some context again. We're coming from different areas. I'm not coming from science journalism. I'm coming as a researcher, as a scholar in the social sciences and humanities. I should have made that clear. And I had no business talking about the biomedical funders, because that's really outside my ken. I have other funders. But it is still an important aspect to think as researchers. We're still novices because the paper authors are the expert on the topic. And so we shouldn't be intimidated by that. We should come to it with the sense that we're going to do more with the paper. And maybe I'll stop there and I'll come back. That was my teaser for my next round of responses. Jason, back to you.
No, yeah, thank you so much, John, about talking about more so how we can develop a framework for how we go about like reading scientific papers as well. I particularly liked your usage of context and how there's different contexts that apply to us when we're like reading a paper. So there's a context when we're going about the selection process of like which paper we're going to read. There's also the context of once you're actually inside of the paper, what parts of that scientific work are going to be relevant to you personally. So I think, yeah, both of those are really good points. And now I guess diving into the situation where, let's say you are, interested in a new field of research, but there's a lot of terminology that is unsure to you. You aren't necessarily familiar with the research field. So how would you suggest to a struggling student or just someone that's trying to get into a particular research field, how do you go about trying to understand this new content and break down information that might seem foreign to you?
Back to Deborah.
Well, science journalists have to do that all the time, right? We're always diving into different areas of science. You know what, you can, like I have, really concentrate on one field, but many people, and especially at large publications, let's say like the New York Times or the Washington Post, find themselves reporting across several disciplines. So to me, the most important thing that we do is do our homework in advance of asking any questions, right? So when I'm going into a new field and one that I don't think I know particularly well, I'll try to do a sort of general backgrounding on the field. Again, I'll sometimes use Google Scholar. Well, let me give you just a really specific example of the way I work, which might be helpful. So when I wrote, for almost 2 years, I wrote a column for the New York Times called Poison Pen, which was about toxicology. And when they started, they said, and the one thing we don't want you to write about is BPA because it's a non-issue. And I took that as a personal challenge. I mean, I didn't tell my editor that, but I'm like, surely at some point I can find an interesting way to write about BPA, which is something I know nothing about, right? And so when I started looking at that, I really just started by looking at that whole issue of endocrine disruptors. I went to the Endocrine Society and asked them for a couple of people. And I will say, and I want to say this in my experience as a science writer, if you actually care about getting it right, people in the science community are incredibly generous with their time because they do want you to get it right. Right. And so I really think one of the things that journalists bring to the table is our willingness to ask the, I don't understand this. Can you explain it as you would to your mother? Um, how do you translate that? Is there another way of taking this piece of jargon, right, and turning it into something that is a more universal understanding? And so I'm perfectly willing to ask all of those questions when I do interview. And my process is to start very broadly, let me understand the field, and then narrow in more on the specifics. So with my BPA story, I eventually discovered a review on BPA science that allowed me to really understand what was going on. And I'm a huge fan of reviews, right? They're not necessarily groundbreaking, but they are a survey of a field, and they will allow you to often get a sense of who the players are and what the discussion has been and what the research is that has been sort of floating to everyone's attention and driving a conversation. So I like to start, like I say, almost in that review sense, and then narrow my focus back down. And if I don't understand what something means, I'll ask it. And there is a famous journalistic technique in this regard called an echo interview, which when you're dealing with the media, you may occasionally encounter yourself, which is that I'm a chemist and I'm talking to you about H2O. And the journalist says, well, if I'm following you right, you're talking about water, right? So, and you're saying water does these things. So you take the scientific explanation that someone has given to you and you repeat it back to them in your own understanding. And that gives them a chance to say, no, you're wrong. Right. I wasn't talking about water at all. Right. I was really talking about this and that was only. And that's a really important technique, both as a journalist, because you get to test whether you're understanding the jargon, but also because it allows the researcher you're talking to have some power to make sure that you're going in the right direction. And I'll finish this by saying, when I do an interview, the last question I always ask is, what have I screwed up? When you hear me, when you heard me, when you listen to my questions, when you listen to the way I was exploring this issue, was there something that set off a red flag for you and you thought, oh, she's going down the wrong alley there? Because you want to give people every opportunity to correct you if you're wrong. And that's an important part of that inquiry process.
Thank you for those comments, Deborah. I also want, actually, speaking of questions, so if you guys, any of the people who are watching this right now, have any questions for the panelists, be sure to put them into the Q&A section. I see that John has already started off answering some of those questions. But yeah, let's try to make this as interactive as possible. And actually, so now I'll direct the question towards Christina. So in your bio, we learned a little bit about your experience with, I guess, working on films and short documentaries. So how do you kind of dive into the research process for creating the films about this material when you might not necessarily have like formal, like let's say biological training or courses on that topic?
Absolutely. So being a fact checker for NOVA means that I, in the same day can be working on projects about anything from physics to cancer research to, biology. And so that can be a real challenge. My training is in ecology and evolution, but, obviously I need to be well-versed in these other fields as well. So I would agree absolutely with everything that Deborah said about kind of how to approach understanding jargon. And for me, kind of the first thing that I'll do when I'm interviewing someone, I'll ask, this is my understanding of your paper, is it correct? And I'll kind of summarize in 1 to 2 sentences what I think the takeaway of the paper is. So that's the results or, why those results are important. And oftentimes that's where the scientists will jump in and say, hey, not so much, right? And that's really where I learned something. And that little misunderstanding is often where the interesting story lies, where that misinterpretation might be. I'll also say that a great question to ask the PI or the first author, whoever it is you're interviewing, is what's an analogy for understanding this system or this this agent, right? And because that's usually what will resonate with your reader or your viewer if you're working on film. And you know, that's a way to eliminate or minimize the jargon or the technical terms that are involved. So I would say that's a great sort of approach to simplifying it. And again, what Deborah said about, you know, how would you explain this to your mother? That's another really great question to ask. You know, unless their mother's, you know, a scientist herself, then other than that, that's a great approach. Does that answer your question, Jason?
Oh yeah, thank you. Really appreciate that perspective, especially someone that is writing scientific articles about topics from such a wide variety of different fields. So John, do you have any anything to add about trying to break down jargon, or, you know, I think you already commented on this earlier. Yeah, any additional comments?
Yes, Jason, let me just comment, first of all, on the intensity of the format here, where I'm answering questions in one hand that are coming up, really interesting questions that are being raised, keeping an ear open for what's being said and formulating my next response. So let me see if I've got this in the right order. This will be my next response. So the context, I would propose that you think about using other media as well. So I'm a big exponent of Wikipedia. And that wasn't always the case, but it has increasingly established itself, incredibly enough, in the biomedical field. I just want to say that because I do research in this area, and I've been deeply impressed by the group that manages the biomedical aspects of Wikipedia, the entries there, Wiki Project Medicine it's called. So I would have a screen open with Wikipedia and a screen open. In fact, I do work on intellectual history, and if I have a weak point in my own historical understanding, I'll jump into Wikipedia and get that context, then go back into the advanced article that I'm reading and working with. Similarly with elusive historical figures, my Leibniz and Newton debate on calculus, I need to refresh that every 5 years. And to kind of stay on top of things, and Wikipedia does a terrific job of that. It has references, it's very well cited, and sometimes it even leads to what I think are better citations than the one I'm working with. And then I would go back to my colleagues in journalism. I think the New York Times, Washington Post, other forums are very good things to check. Take the funder issue that Christina raised at the beginning. If there's something about the funders that you're wondering about, then there may be a story, maybe not, maybe I'm too suspicious, maybe I'm too cynical, but sometimes funders get into the newspaper for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the pharmaceuticals, which are doing very well at this point, thank you very much in terms of COVID, but there can be controversies around this, involving the researcher, involving the funder. So I would build that context. I would look at the news media, and then I would look at knowledge supports like Wikipedia as a way of trying to understand gain a mastery of the concepts. And that's what you really want from this, the work with the research papers. It's the results are interesting, but you're trying to build a conceptual map, if you like. You're trying to build an understanding of relationships among ideas. And so don't think of it as cheating when you go to Wikipedia. Don't cite Wikipedia in your papers. That rule still stands. But you can cite papers that are cited in Wikipedia, and you can thank Wikipedia for finding those papers for you, because those papers will be peer-reviewed literature. They will be available hopefully for free, but often through your library. And those papers will have been vetted at least by the editor and other editors. What's remarkable in Wikipedia is how the scrutiny of editors, and so that everything has a kind of vetting process in Wikipedia, but not the same as peer review, which I think we're going to speak about in terms of student journals in a moment or two. So Jason, I need to go back to answering, I haven't finished this one question from Eva, and I've got responsibilities here. So if you could just take over for a few minutes, and I'll complete this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess also building off upon that, there's also this interesting dichotomy of people who are in scientific communication of trying to understand existing concepts, so fundamental concepts that exist in the field that can, like, I guess, sort of couch your understanding and allow you to tackle harder concepts. But then at the same time, there's also new concepts that are coming into a rapidly changing field. There are tons of new ideas. There's tons of new research that is coming out, especially in fields such as COVID research that are particularly relevant to the public. So I guess the next question that I want to pose is, science is a rapidly changing field. Articles are sometimes released 5 to 10 years in the past, and already those research articles become quite antiquated. So how do we best approach reading older articles, and more broadly, what should our goals be when we're reading them?
So I'm going to address this briefly as a science journalist, and COVID-19 is a great example of the point you make about sort of the rapid fire nature of current research. You'll see in mainstream publications like the New York Times much more reference to preprints now than you ever did. And for a long time, there was a debate in journalism as to whether you should even write about preprints or research that had not gone through formal peer review. And so you're seeing us do that more because we have to acknowledge the pace of the research. And in the case of something like a preprint, just for a minute, excuse me, I think the most important thing is to explain that it is a preprint, and for your readership to never assume that they know what that means, right? One of the worst mistakes we make in science communication is the everybody already knows this, right? So when we're writing about a preprint or we're writing about a single study paper, and you've certainly seen a lot of this in COVID, then you have to put it in and this is a preprint, and this is what that actually means, and this is where that's going to fit into the process. And I think it's really important, and this is going to lead me back to older papers, for journalism, and it's something we really struggle with, to portray science as a process. The news media is event driven, and we tend to write about a paper or a new finding as an event, when a lot of times it's just a data point in the process. So, and I'm not sure we'll ever entirely overcome that kind of culture conflict between the two, but it's something that I think puts pressure on us, again, going back to the use of context, to say, this is what this means. With COVID-19, I did a whole series of Q&As for Undark, answering readers' questions. And there were times when I found older papers about coronaviruses really helpful. And again, I just want to mention that in context. It's not like we throw out everything we've learned in the past, and it's not as if older papers don't have meaning. There's fundamental knowledge in older papers. And even though our understanding may be changing, it rests on this body of work. The famous quote about standing on the shoulders of giants, in which it's important for us to understand how we got to this point, and what's still relevant and what is not relevant. And if I look, for instance, at, again, I'm going to use toxicology because that's what I'm most interested in, but if I look at a paper on arsenic from the 19th century, it actually tells me something about our understanding of arsenic as a metalloid element, right? So I think, again, the whole value of that is it adds to your body of understanding. And finally, when I was studying, I did my grad degree in science journalism at the University of Wisconsin. And my advisor, who had a joint appointment in wildlife biology and journalism, sent me off into the history of science department. And because he said no good science journalists can report on the field unless they understand the history of the field. And one of the most important things, and this goes back to older papers, is that it allows you, when someone claims that they're the first, to fact check them, right? They're not always the first, right? And it's really important to give credit to the people who laid down the foundation of any area of research. And so that is my take on that.
So yeah, I'd also be interested in hearing some responses from Christina. So especially, like, as you're I guess particularly I'm interested in how you deal with like the veracity of the information that you try to portray to the public. Because in a particular field, I guess as it is rapidly growing, as there's more and more research coming out, there's a possibility that the work that you initially publish could be like antiquated by the time it gets out. Like, how do you try to circumvent that issue or plan for that potentially?
Yeah, so that's definitely a great question, particularly with regards to the pandemic. In May, we did a quick turnaround film called Decoding COVID-19, which you heard about in my bio. And for that, definitely the timeliness of our work was a big consideration. For that film, we turned it around in under 6 weeks. But normally for a film, we work on it for between 1 and several years. And so certainly the research that we're doing at the very beginning of the R&D phase can be outdated by the time we get to the fact-checking phase, which is kind of my purview. And that comes close to delivery, so at the very end of the process. And I'd say my approach to kind of understanding an older paper, if you will, that's something that perhaps was published in the case of COVID several weeks ago, but normally, up to 5 years ago, would be to understand how it underlies the assumptions we make in more modern research. And one way that I can do that is by looking at what papers, more current papers, have cited that older publication. And to say, okay, what assumptions are they making now that are based on that original research? And then when I go back to the older paper, I can say, okay, what biases did they have in the way they collected the data or the way they analyzed the data? And what problems can that introduce for, the paper that we're citing now or using to fact check now? So I would say that for fact-checking purposes at NOVA, we try to use the most current research that we can, unless we're talking about science that was done several years ago. Obviously, then an older publication would be the more appropriate choice. But I would say that the value that an older paper has is really in understanding the assumptions that we make now in the field.
Wow, I'm deeply impressed. So this is a science journalism appreciation course or session rather, because I'm growing leaps and bounds in terms of my support, Deborah and Christina, for what you're doing. And that's terrific. And I'm honored that you pay this kind of attention to the work that my colleagues do. You haven't come to me yet, but I know one day I'll get my attention. So let me add a little bit to this from more from the students' point of view and from the faculty point of view in terms of the history. There was a time when everything went digital that we were worried about where the older articles would go. They would be buried in the basements of the libraries and they wouldn't be used. And we've missed some of the things that Deborah and Christina talked about, but it turns out now that the back issues are online, going back into the 19th century and the 16th, 17th century. In fact, the first journal that was ever published in the 1664, perhaps, Philosophical Transactions, is available online. So I would suggest from a student's and a researcher's point of view that you want to provide a sense of that historical context, that you want to take pride in understanding the origins of these ideas. You might even be surprised by what's been missed and what's been left behind. Lots of important discoveries are made by going back to a breakthrough piece and realizing that only one aspect was taken up and brought forward. And so in the social sciences and the humanities in particular, we talk about the long tail of research. We talk about the contributions that have been made over the course of the 20th century. I know that seems like ancient history to you, but even earlier than the 20th century, there are still valuable ideas that are available and should be worked. And so I would take pride in having both very recent research, yesterday's research, and then yesteryear's research, that you've done that kind of digging. And again, to Christina's point about the origin of the ideas, the genealogy. And this again builds on that conceptual map that you're working on, builds on that, the way in which you, as it were, conceive the field and have those origins. And I think it will serve you extremely well. So let's have a shout out for older papers. And for the kind of historical roots of our work. It's not that there's nothing new under the sun. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that ideas come from other ideas, and that the within our field, the openness and the sharing, the sense of a commons, which is where my work is on the sense of intellectual commons, is a really important aspect, and your work can demonstrate that. But it's also a way to fact check. That's great, and also a way to think about doing journalism, science journalism. That's even better. Thank you. To you. Jason, back to you.
Yeah, honestly, it's been really interesting hearing these different perspectives, and I really like the idea that's coming out of these questions, which is sort of the importance of context, as well as how we can look at the importance of a paper by the different papers it is connected to. So sort of this like network view of looking at science, that it's not necessarily a singular data point, but it's how the data points interact with one another. And that just goes to show, you know, how this field doesn't just require looking at like singular pieces of information, but really trying to synthesize a whole lot of information and then making that information like salient and relevant to other audiences. So yeah, I'm really happy that we could touch upon that. And then I guess I'm also going to shift gears, I guess, to talking about how we as editors of science journals can approach some of our own submissions, and how we can go about trying to edit scientific research before we publish it in our own undergraduate journals. So I guess starting at a high level, what are the types of review processes that are considered standard in industry? What are the sort of pros and cons of these different approaches? So would anyone like to start?
I could jump out of order.
Yeah, go for it, John.
Okay, because I want to give a little bit of context. I have an advantage, Christine and Deborah, because building journal software is part of my life. And so I take a great deal of pride that students in the US and Canada and around the world use software that we develop for publishing. And in particular, it's called Open Journal Systems. And we're the Public Knowledge Project. But in particular, what we've done is we've tried to build in the standard practices of scholarly journalism into our software, so that the blind review, the assignment of editors, the copy editing and production aspects of creating PDFs, all of those elements can be done. It's a free open source software package. It's used by about 9,000 journals, not student journals, grown-up, adult, what do we say, professional scholarly journals. But the idea that what's important, I think, is the sense of a scientific process or a journal process. And even though I've gained greatly in respect for Deborah and Christina's work, and there are two areas in terms of the scrutiny, so I'm not saying that there's greater scrutiny, but I am saying that there's a tradition. There's a different pattern that distinguishes the journal from journalism, which is kind of confusing since they both use the same term from the French journal. But at any rate, the academic paper, let me put it that way, not confuse you anymore. The academic paper is a different order of knowledge, and it's a different order because of the scrutiny that it receives in the blind review. Deborah has an editor, the journal has an editor, but the blind reviewers is a distinguishing aspect. So I'm just suggesting that we treat the review process with a great deal of respect, that we, as editors, you need to support each other around that in terms of the standards and the norms. The advantage you have as students is the standard is peer review. And what is the peer review of an undergraduate student? It's not a professor. It's not a postdoc. The peer reviewer of an undergraduate paper is another undergraduate student. Those are the peers. And to establish that kind of peer aspect of a culture of concern and interest with a focus on helping the paper do what it wants to do, not to hurt the paper, not to hurt the author, though some of us have been hurt by peer reviews. I can just feel a little twitch on my shoulder here. So that does happen. But the intent should be a culture of support, of nurturing, of developing the ideas, and that honoring the author who has taken the time to contribute a work is a process of helping that author realize their intentions and helping the audience, as it were, that double obligation. So let me set it out on those terms and then turn it over to Christina. We're going out of order this time, Deborah. Christina, let me turn it over to you. Do you have anything to add to that?
I lost track of the original question. What was the original question?
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about what are the common review processes that are used in the industry, and sort of like how undergraduate journals can learn from that process of editorializing.
Yeah, so I think I absolutely agree with everything that John said. I will say that in terms of the peer review process, I think one challenge for undergraduate journals is that we're often forced to review papers that aren't necessarily in our area of expertise. And so, of course, from, as we talked about as journalists, we can try to understand the jargon or talk to the source and kind of understand the context for that research, but it makes it more challenging to review it really as a peer in that field. And so I would say that's a major challenge for undergraduate journals that is not present in the peer review process, or as John called them, grown-up journals. But I will say so that that's something that could perhaps be improved. But yeah, does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I really got at
definitely,
it. Yeah,
definitely. So Deborah, so I guess from your perspectives, do you have any recommendations on how journals can go about creating an editorial process in general that works for them?
It's interesting. And first I want to say, and John, I was reminded of this when John was just talking, of how much I've learned from being on this panel. It's been really interesting to hear these other smart perspectives, and it's reminded me, of just how great it is to listen to smart people talk about their work. Regarding scientific, I want to say the one thing I want to say about scientific journals is that, from my perspective, one of the most important things, and I think we're seeing more of this, is for editors to add some transparency to the process. At the Night Science Journalism program here at MIT, we have one of the senior editors of the New England Journal of Medicine comes in and talks to the journalists in my group every year to just explain how the journal makes decisions and how they vet papers. And I think in terms of actually trusting the enterprise of science, that transparency is really important, and it hasn't always been clear. I know Christina earlier mentioned the fact that a lot of journals will put funding into the papers, but that wasn't always true. There was a lot of cultural pressure and a lot of mistakes made and a lot of papers accepted that did have biased funding sources that were not acknowledged before journals started making that decision. So I think in this case, we want to see more transparency. And I'll give you just a real quick example. There was a recent very controversial piece that was published in one of the Nature journals by a couple of researchers from the Middle East, suggesting that male mentors are so much better than female mentors. And if you looked at my Twitter feed, just blew up with this because people were so angry. And so you started seeing people who were involved in the journal saying, Nature actually put out some of the comments of the reviewers, right? They were trying to address the blowback. They acknowledged that their own reviewers have been critical of the piece. And I think the more that we see journals doing this kind of transparent acknowledgement of problems, right, and how we should work with them, the better off we're all going to be. I should say, and this is not journal related, but might be helpful to all of you. People who edit science are important gatekeepers, both in scientific journals and in the mainstream and other media. And this is something that we have been working on in my program, the problem of, training people to edit science well. And we've gotten funding both from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Kavli Foundation. And in about a little over a week, we're going to put a free handbook for science editors online. And it is written by there's a chapter from Laura Helmuth, the editor-in-chief of Scientific American, and there's a chapter from Apoorva Mandavili from the New York Times, just working your way through how to be smart about editing in science. And in that is an understanding of peer review, a look at how to vet sources, how to handle controversial science. So if you came over to our website, which is just ksj@mit.edu, ksj.mit.edu, in about a week and a half, you could download that whole handbook for free or read it online. And if you're interested in kind of seeing this, I'd encourage you to do it.
Yeah, I actually want to mention that Apoorva Mandavili is actually going to be a panelist later today in the careers panel. So definitely stop by that and listen to them speak. And I guess, so in the interest of time, we're going to switch now to a Q&A. But I just want to say thank you so much, John, Deborah, and Christina, for answering the questions that I fielded to you guys today. I feel like I learned a lot about the different aspects of scientific journalism, especially from the different areas of expertise that you all have. So yeah, thank you guys so much for that. So now transitioning to some Q&A. So we have a ton of questions from the audience. So I guess just to be fair, I'll go in sequential order. So first is Stephanie Guo, who asks, thank you guys so much for speaking with us today. I was wondering what strategies you use to try to minimize your own personal biases when reading and communicating research findings. So any takers for that?
Well, let me jump in really quickly and say, I think it's important to acknowledge that everyone brings their biases to the table. And even in your decision that a certain area of research is important, that's your subjective opinion, right? But I want to go back to something that you actually mentioned earlier, Jason, that is important in science journalism, and that's reading for consensus. And so I find, and this is something, let me just back up for a minute and say one of the great failings of science journalism in the late 20th century and even early 21st was a failure to read for consensus on the subject of climate change. And we tended to follow the old political model. Republican says the opposite side is the Democrat, right? The two sides of the story. So that we would present climate change, and then your editor would always make you go out and find a scientist. And often these guys were funded by the oil and gas industry to counter that, instead of actually reading for consensus and reporting on where the weight of the evidence is at the time. So I find for myself that whatever my perspective is, I will read for consensus and I'll look for weight of evidence before I report. And if I don't find it and it doesn't hold up, there was a friend of mine who was a longtime science writer at the San Francisco Chronicle, and he had a whole file of what he called stories too good to check, which meant that once you actually started looking at the story, it didn't hold up. So you have to go in and you have to look for weight of evidence, and then you report from that position, not your position. And I think, and not necessarily, as I said, the old models of two sides of every story model of journalism doesn't always work either. Sometimes you really have to do your homework, find the consensus and the weight of evidence, and report from there, acknowledging, I think, as we've said a number of times here, that the perspective can change and that the consensus can be wrong, right? And so you have to also allow for that in the back of your head, right? I hope that's helpful.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that, Deborah. John, did you have an additional comment?
Yes, I want to reserve my comment because it might interfere with what Deborah said. So I want to reinforce the point you made, Deborah. Thank you.
So I think we have time for probably like one more question. So I'll ask one that's directed towards Christina. So how did you become involved in creating documentaries? Did you take any kinds of film classes during undergrad that led you to this career?
Yeah, so I actually did not take any film classes in undergrad. I came at this from a science communication perspective, which is a little bit distinct from science journalism. But I started out thinking that I wanted to do science and realized that I was a better communicator than I was a researcher. And that I felt, the step that was perhaps de-emphasized in the scientific method was really talking about the science and conveying it to the public. And so I started out very early in my college career, just applying to a bunch of SciComm internships, and I landed at NOVA, which was a really lucky find, and I was very fortunate to land there. I interned with their broadcast research team, and after that, just kind of hung around, stayed in touch, and went to visit them at the office every chance I got, and stayed front of mind so that when an opening did come around, I was able to be hired first as a production assistant and then now as their associate researcher. So it was a lot of luck and a lot of just staying in touch and networking that got me this position. But, and I would say if there's anyone out there who's really looking for a career, this maybe touches on a later panel, but if you are looking for a career in this, networking is huge. It's not a huge field. But I would say, I didn't necessarily start out thinking that I wanted to do documentary. It was just a medium that I found to be very helpful in science communication, and one that I found had a wide audience and that could reach audiences that perhaps print journalism and print SciComm couldn't reach.
Thank you. Any last comments from the panelists before we transition to the next section of the conference?
Thank you.
No? All right. Thank you guys
to,
so much. Really appreciated you guys talking. Honestly, virtual round of applause for you guys.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting
Really.
this.
Jason.